Okay, so imagine this. You need to refuel, but instead of pumping gas, you just swap your entire tank out in minutes.
Yeah.
That's the idea behind battery swapping for EVs.
Right.
And it's getting a lot of attention, especially over in Indonesia. You actually sent over a whole bunch of research on this, academic papers, looking at the potential and the challenges, especially in Indonesia. There's even one that used computer simulations to model how different policies could impact the adoption of this whole battery swapping thing.
Yeah.
So why don't we break this down? What do we need to know about battery swapping? Why is Indonesia going all in on this? And what does it all mean for the future of how we get around?
Well, Indonesia is a really, really interesting case study. They're one of the top 10 global emitters of greenhouse gases.
Wow.
And they've set some pretty ambitious targets for reducing emissions by 2030. But, and this is a big but, motorcycles, they're like the main way people get around there. So, if you can electrify those motorcycles, that's a big step towards hitting those emission reduction targets. And that's where battery swapping comes in.
So it seems like a pretty simple idea, but could you maybe walk us through how this battery swapping thing actually works?
Sure, yeah. So imagine a pit stop in Formula One, but for, everyday commuters.
Oh, okay.
Instead of plugging in your EV to charge, you go to a specialized station, and they have a robotic system that swaps out your depleted battery for a fully charged one. And the whole process takes just a few minutes, which is way faster than conventional charging.
Yeah, it definitely solves that whole time issue. But aren't there different ways to do this swapping?
Yeah, there are actually 4 main types.
Yeah.
Sideways, bottom, rear seat, and vertical. And each method has its own sort of pros and cons. It's interesting, Tesla actually considered rear seat swapping at one point.
Oh, really?
But they ultimately decided to abandon that idea and stick with their supercharger network, at least for now.
So why all the hype about battery swapping? What are the advantages besides the speed?
Well, it tackles some of the biggest obstacles to people actually using EVs. So first, as we talked about, it cuts down on that refueling time. Imagine being able to refuel your electric motorcycle as fast as you can fill up a gas tank.
Right.
That alone, that convenience factor, that could be huge.
Yeah.
Second, it eliminates range anxiety. You don't have to stress about running out of charge, especially if you're on a long trip, because you could just swap your battery and keep going. And then third, there's the potential for cost savings.
Cost savings. So how does that work?
One possibility is battery leasing. So instead of owning the battery, which is a big chunk of the cost of an EV, you could lease it from a service provider. And that would make EVs more affordable. And it would also potentially reduce the hassle of battery maintenance and replacement. And because the swap stations would be the ones managing the charging and maintenance of the batteries, it could actually extend their lifespan as well.
So it's not just about convenience and cost savings. There are also potential environmental benefits, right?
Absolutely. Swapping could make it easier to recycle batteries because the stations act as these centralized collection points.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And since battery production takes a lot of resources and could have a pretty big environmental impact, swapping could help reduce the need to make new batteries all the time. It's about creating a more circular economy for those battery materials.
Okay, so we've established that battery swapping has some pretty compelling advantages. Now let's focus on Indonesia. Why are they so interested in this?
Well, Indonesia's kind of in a unique spot. Like we said, they're a major greenhouse gas emitter, and they're determined to move towards a more sustainable transportation system. Motorcycles, they're everywhere in Indonesia. So electrifying them is a top priority. And the government is actively promoting electric motorcycle adoption. They're doing things like offering incentives and investing in charging infrastructure.
But I've read that electric motorcycle adoption is still pretty low in Indonesia, so why is that?
That's right. Even with the government's efforts, there were only about 900 registered electric motorcycles in Jakarta as of a few years ago.
Wow.
That's a tiny fraction of the total number of motorcycles on the road. So there's a big gap between what they want to do and the reality.
So what's holding them back? What are the main challenges?
One big one is the lack of standardization. For battery swapping to work smoothly, batteries from different motorcycle manufacturers need to be interchangeable.
Yeah.
Imagine you pull up to a swap station and their batteries don't fit your bike.
Right.
That would be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, it would be. So how are they addressing that?
The Indonesian Battery Corporation is playing a key role here. They're working with motorcycle manufacturers to establish industry-wide standards for batteries. And that's essential for creating a battery swapping ecosystem that actually works.
Okay, that's good news. But standardization is just one piece of the puzzle. What other obstacles are they facing?
Another big one is making sure there's a reliable and affordable supply of electricity. The state electricity company, PLN, needs to make sure there's enough power to support a whole network of swap stations. And the price of electricity, that's really important. If it's too expensive, it could make battery swapping less appealing than just filling up with gas.
Right, because if it costs more to swap a battery than to fill up your tank, people aren't going to do it. And what about the cost of actually building all of those swap stations? That can't be cheap.
It's not. The research you sent over highlights how expensive it is to build a battery swapping network. And that can be a major roadblock for private companies.
Yeah.
So that's where government support comes in. They can offer things like subsidies or incentives to help get things moving.
Okay, so it sounds like there are some pretty big financial hurdles to overcome. But even if they can figure out the money and the infrastructure, there's still the question of whether people will actually use this new technology.
That's a really important point. You know, even if you have the technology and you have the infrastructure, you still need to convince people that this is a good option.
Yeah.
And that's where understanding how people think comes into play.
Okay, so what are some of the psychological factors at play here?
The research you sent dives into this idea of range anxiety. It's a common worry among people who drive EVs.
Sure.
They're afraid of running out of charge, especially if they're far from home. And battery swapping addresses that directly because it offers this quick and easy way to refuel.
Okay.
But there are other things too, like how convenient people think it is, the cost, and even safety concerns.
Right.
People need to feel like swapping is easy, it's affordable, and it's safe.
It seems like educating people about the benefits of battery swapping and addressing their concerns, that's going to be really important if this is going to be successful. But even with all these challenges, one of the research papers you sent over, it took a really interesting approach. They built a computer simulation to look at how different policy decisions could affect electric motorcycle adoption in Indonesia.
Right.
So can you tell us a little more about that?
So this research team, they used something called system dynamics modeling to simulate like the whole electric motorcycle ecosystem in Indonesia.
Okay.
It's basically like creating a virtual lab.
Yeah.
Where you can test out different policy options and see how they might play out in the real world.
So it's kind of like a crystal ball for policymakers. They can use this simulation to explore different scenarios and make better decisions.
Exactly. They can adjust things like, government incentives, infrastructure investments, and battery standardization policies, and then see how those changes affect how many people adopt electric motorcycles.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful tool for understanding the potential impact of different choices.
That sounds really useful. So what were some of the key findings from this simulation? Did they discover anything surprising?
One of the most interesting things was that even if things are challenging, like if energy prices are rising, battery swapping could still significantly increase the number of people who use electric motorcycles.
Yeah.
But the simulation also showed how important battery standardization is.
Okay.
Without it, things got really complicated really quickly.
Yeah.
It was much harder to manage all those batteries and make sure that the swap stations had enough charged batteries on hand to meet demand.
So that reinforces what we talked about earlier about making sure those standards are in place. Did the simulation offer any guidance on which policy levers might be most effective in getting people to switch to electric motorcycles?
It did. Actually, one of the more interesting findings was that it might be more effective to incentivize the building of infrastructure, like giving subsidies for swap stations, than it is to directly incentivize people to buy electric motorcycles.
So it's kind of like that build it and they will come philosophy.
Yeah.
If the swap stations are readily available and easy to use, people might be more inclined to switch to electric motorcycles.
That's what it seems to suggest, yeah. The research shows that the availability of that infrastructure can really influence people's choices. When they see that swap stations are convenient and easy to get to, it makes that transition to electric motorcycles much more appealing.
This is all really fascinating, and we've only just scratched the surface. We've gone over the basics of battery swapping, explored why Indonesia is so interested in it, and even gotten a glimpse into the future with this really interesting simulation. But there's so much more to uncover.
There is. We have a lot more research to go through that digs even deeper into the technical, economic, and environmental aspects of battery swapping.
Right, we'll get into all that. We'll also look at some real-world examples of swapping in action, and we'll talk about what this all means for the future of getting from A to B. Stay tuned.
It's really interesting to see how this whole battery swapping idea is being explored and used in different parts of the world. We've been talking about Indonesia, but there are other countries experimenting with it too, especially for bigger vehicles like buses.
That's true. China, for example, has been a kind of a pioneer in battery swapping, especially for those electric buses.
Right, they've been doing it for a while now, actually. They even had battery-swapped electric buses running during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, kind of a big demonstration of what the technology could do on a global stage.
Why buses, though? What makes them so well suited for battery swapping?
Buses are particularly good candidates for a couple of reasons. First, they usually have those fixed routes and schedules.
Right.
So it makes it easier to plan and manage those battery swaps. And second, buses often cover a lot of miles each day, so the time saved by swapping out those batteries instead of charging them can be pretty significant. It helps keep those buses running and moving people around efficiently.
It sounds like battery swapping for buses could be a win-win for the companies that run them and the people who ride them. But what about other kinds of vehicles? Are there any other good examples of battery swapping out there in the real world?
Oh yeah, definitely. One company that comes to mind is Gogoro. They're based in Taiwan, and they've built this whole system around battery swapping for electric scooters.
Okay.
Their scooters look really cool, very modern, and their swap stations are like futuristic vending machines for batteries.
Oh, wow.
You just pull up, swap out your empty battery for a full one, and you're ready to go. It takes just a few seconds.
I've seen pictures of those Gogoro swap stations. They do look pretty impressive. They seem to have really figured out that user experience part of it, like grabbing a fresh cup of coffee, but for your scooter.
Exactly. They've shown that battery swapping can be convenient, user-friendly, even stylish. It's not just this niche technology anymore. It's becoming a real option for some types of vehicles.
And the technology keeps evolving too, right? We talked about those different swapping methods, and I imagine those automation and battery management systems are always being improved.
Oh, absolutely. The whole point is to make swapping as smooth and seamless as possible.
Right.
Companies are always working on better designs for the stations and the robots that handle those batteries. The battery management systems are getting smarter too. They can track the health of each battery, optimize those charging cycles, and make sure the batteries meet certain quality standards.
Sounds like there's a lot of innovation happening behind the scenes to make it more efficient, reliable, and safe. But speaking of innovation, one of the research papers mentioned something that caught my eye, a mobile swapping system.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah.
It's essentially a swap station on wheels, a special vehicle that can go to where the EVs are instead of the other way around.
So instead of having all those fixed swap stations around a city, you could have these mobile units that could be sent out wherever they're needed.
Exactly. Could be really useful in places where they don't have much infrastructure, or for helping out EV drivers who are stranded on the side of the road. Really interesting idea. It shows how flexible and adaptable this technology can be.
It seems like it's more than just a simple swap. It's a whole system of technology, infrastructure, and logistics that all has to work together. And one part of that system we haven't really talked about is the impact on the electricity grid.
That's a really important thing to consider. You know, swap stations use a lot of power, especially if they're charging up multiple batteries at the same time. And that demand could potentially strain the grid, especially during those peak hours when everyone's using electricity.
So it's not enough to just build those swap stations. You also need to make sure the grid can handle it.
Right. The research talked about the need for grid upgrades and smart charging strategies to deal with the impact of all those battery swaps.
Smart charging, what is that exactly?
It's basically about managing when and how fast batteries are charged to avoid putting too much stress on the grid.
Okay.
For example, those stations could be programmed to charge batteries during off-peak hours when demand is lower. That helps balance out the load and makes better use of the energy we already have.
So it's about being strategic with the charging to make sure the grid doesn't get overloaded. Are there other ways to minimize the impact on the grid?
Another approach is to use renewable energy, like solar panels on the swap stations.
Okay.
That way they can generate some of their own power, and it also helps promote the use of clean energy.
Makes sense. It's about looking at the whole energy system and finding ways to make battery swapping more sustainable.
Exactly. And there's this really cool concept called vehicle-to-grid, or V2G technology, that could also play a part in all of this.
I've I've heard of V2G, but I don't really understand how it works. Can you break it down for us?
Imagine a world where electric vehicles aren't just using electricity, but they can also supply it back to the grid. They become like mobile energy storage units.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of just taking power from the grid, they could actually help power it when needed.
So they become part of the solution, not just part of the demand.
Right. It's about creating a more flexible and resilient grid where EVs are actively helping to balance things out.
That sounds pretty futuristic, but how does battery swapping fit into this whole V2G picture?
Those swap stations could act as like hubs for this V2G exchange. They could manage the charging and discharging of those batteries in a way that benefits both the batteries and the grid.
Okay.
It's a really exciting area of research. It could totally change how we think about energy storage and distribution.
It's amazing to think about how all these systems are connected and how new ideas in one area, like battery swapping, can affect the whole energy landscape. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the economics of this. We talked about the costs of those swap stations and the need for subsidies. But is this really a viable business model? Can you actually make money with battery swapping?
A lot of people are asking that same question. And the research you provided has some interesting insights. One thing that's really important is scale.
Scale, as in the more stations you have, the more profitable it becomes.
Exactly. It's that classic network effect.
Yeah.
The more stations you have, the more batteries you can manage, the more swaps you can do, the more revenue you can generate. It's about reaching that tipping point where it all starts to make financial sense.
But it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? You need a lot of stations to make it profitable, but you need to show that it's profitable to attract investors to build those stations.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
And that's where those partnerships and government support are so important. Those early adopters, the people who are willing to take the risk, can help get things started, and government incentives can make those early investments more attractive.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about creating the right conditions for it to succeed. The policies, the standardized batteries, the efficient swap systems, the smart grid integration, and the investors who are willing to back it. It's a complex puzzle with a lot of pieces.
Absolutely. It's a big challenge, but the potential payoff is huge. If we can get all those pieces in place, battery swapping could really revolutionize transportation. It could help more people switch to EVs, create a stronger and more sustainable energy grid, and lead to a cleaner and more efficient transportation system.
It's an exciting vision, but like with any disruptive technology, there are bound to be some challenges and downsides that we need to address. One that comes to mind is, what about battery degradation? Batteries don't last forever, and they lose capacity over time. How does battery swapping deal with that?
That's a valid point, and it's something that researchers and companies are working on. Remember those battery management systems we talked about? Well, one of their main jobs is to keep an eye on the health of each battery.
Yeah.
They can track how many times a battery has been charged and discharged, how much capacity it's lost, and how its performance is changing over time.
So it's like having a doctor for your battery. They're always checking up on it, making sure it's healthy.
That's a great way to put it. And if a battery starts to show signs of serious wear and tear, the system can flag it for removal from the swap pool. That helps keep the overall quality and reliability of the swap batteries high.
That makes sense. But even with those systems, there's still a chance of damage during the swapping process, right? Those batteries are being moved around, connected and disconnected over and over. It seems like they could get worn down or even accidentally damaged.
You're right, there's always that risk when you're handling physical things, especially sensitive components like batteries. That's why the design and engineering of those stations and the robots that handle the batteries is so important.
Yeah.
They need to be robust, reliable, and safe. They have to minimize the risk of damage during those swaps.
So it's not just about speed and efficiency, it's also about making sure the batteries last and are safe to use. They need to be able to handle all that swapping without affecting their performance or safety. But even if we can solve those technical challenges, there's still the human side of it. How do we know that people will actually go for this battery swapping idea?
That's the key question, and it's something researchers are looking into through surveys, focus groups, and real-world tests. There are definitely some psychological barriers to overcome. Some people might not like the idea of giving up ownership of their batteries, or they might have concerns about the cost, whether they can find a swap station, or the quality of the swap batteries.
So it's not just about building the technology, it's about building trust with people. They need to feel confident that this is a safe, reliable, and affordable option.
Exactly. Education and marketing will be really important in shaping how people perceive battery swapping. Companies need to explain the benefits clearly, address those concerns, and show why it's a better choice than traditional charging.
It's about helping people feel comfortable with this new way of doing things and showing them how it can make their lives easier and be good for the environment.
Absolutely. And speaking of the environment, let's go back to the sustainability side of this. We talked about how it could potentially make the grid more sustainable, but what about the environmental impact of the batteries themselves?
That's a good point. It seems a bit contradictory. On one hand, battery swapping could mean we need fewer batteries overall because they're being shared. But on the other hand, making those batteries is energy intensive and can be bad for the environment.
You're absolutely right. It's a complicated issue with potential upsides and downsides. One of the big advantages of battery swapping for sustainability is that it makes it easier to recycle those batteries.
Because those swap stations act as collection points, making it easier to deal with those batteries when they reach the end of their life.
Exactly. Instead of each EV owner having to figure out how to dispose of their battery, which can be a logistical and environmental headache, swap stations can make that recycling process much smoother.
Right.
They can make sure the batteries are handled properly and that those valuable materials they contain are recovered and reused.
So it's about creating a more circular economy for batteries, reducing waste and the need to mine new materials. But even with better recycling, making batteries still has an environmental impact, right?
It does, and that's why it's so important to think about the whole life cycle of those batteries, from mining those raw materials to manufacturing, using, and eventually recycling and disposing of them.
It's about taking a holistic view and trying to minimize the environmental impact at every stage. But even with that life cycle perspective, there are still challenges. Building and running those swap stations also has an impact, right?
Yeah, you're right. It takes energy and resources to build and operate those stations. The materials used in construction, the electricity they consume, and transporting those batteries all contribute to that environmental footprint.
So it's not a perfect solution, but it seems like battery swapping could be an important part of a more sustainable future for transportation. It's about weighing the pros and cons and trying to minimize those negative impacts while maximizing the benefits.
Exactly. It's about constantly improving and innovating. We need to keep pushing the boundaries of technology, finding new materials and designs, and making battery swapping even more efficient and sustainable.
It's a journey, but an exciting one. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how we think about transportation and energy, and battery swapping is a big part of that. It's a technology that has the potential to reshape our cities, our economies, and how we interact with the environment.
I completely agree. It's a time of a lot of change and innovation, and it's fascinating to see how these technologies are developing and interacting with each other. But as we dig deeper into this world of battery swapping, it's important to remember that technology is just one piece of the puzzle.
That's a good point. What else do we need to consider besides the technical and economic stuff?
One thing that often gets overlooked is the social and societal impact. How will this affect people's lives, their jobs, their communities? We need to think about the bigger picture, beyond just how to get people from one place to another.
It's been really interesting to look at the potential of battery swapping, its impact on emissions, the electricity grid, even urban planning. But I'm curious about how this technology might affect people just in their everyday lives.
That's a great question. One area where we might see a big shift is in how people think about owning things, especially when it comes to those batteries. Right now, most people who buy an EV, they own the battery too. But with battery swapping, there's a chance that leasing could become the norm.
So instead of owning this big, expensive piece of technology, you'd be more like subscribing to a battery service, like what we do with our phones or software these days.
Exactly. And that could have some really interesting effects. For one, it could make EVs more attractive to a wider range of people. The cost of the battery is a big hurdle for a lot of people, especially if they're on a budget. Leasing could make EVs a lot more affordable.
It's like renting an apartment versus buying a house. Renting takes less money up front, and it gives you more flexibility.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And just like renting, battery leasing could give people more options. Imagine being able to easily upgrade to a newer, better battery as technology improves without having to buy a whole new car. Or maybe you need to switch to a smaller, cheaper battery because your driving needs change.
Yeah, that kind of flexibility could really shake things up in the EV market. But this whole service-based model, it does raise some questions like, who would be responsible for taking care of and replacing those leased batteries?
That's where those battery swapping companies come in. They basically become like the caretakers of those batteries, making sure they're high quality, safe, and reliable. That would probably involve regular maintenance, checking how they're performing, and replacing them when necessary.
So it's not just about setting up those swap stations, it's about building a whole system for managing and supporting those batteries. That sounds pretty complicated.
It is. It would take a lot of investment in technology, infrastructure, and expertise. But there's a lot to gain, too. A well-run battery leasing system could not only help more people use EVs, but it could also make those batteries last longer, improve recycling rates, and even help stabilize the electricity grid.
We've talked about how swapping could help balance supply and demand on the grid, but what about the environmental impact of all those batteries?
That's a critical question. Making batteries takes a lot of resources and can be hard on the environment. It involves mining for those important minerals, often in places that are ecologically sensitive, and the manufacturing process itself uses a lot of energy.
So even though battery swapping might mean we need fewer batteries overall, it doesn't completely solve those environmental problems that come with making them.
That's true, but there's a potential upside here. Battery swapping could actually push companies to develop more sustainable and ethical ways to produce batteries.
How so?
Well, think about it. If these swapping companies are the ones responsible for the whole life of the batteries they lease, including getting rid of them properly, they have a big reason to invest in batteries that are built to last, can be recycled easily, and have the smallest environmental impact possible.
So it becomes like a closed loop where the company benefits from making those batteries as sustainable as possible.
Exactly. And that could lead to innovations in battery chemistry, manufacturing processes, and recycling technologies. It could create a system where making money and being environmentally friendly actually go hand in hand.
That's a nice thought. But I still have some concerns, especially about data privacy. If these systems are collecting all this information about our driving habits and how we use energy, who has access to that data and how are they using it?
That's a really important question and one we need to address directly. Like with any technology that gathers personal information, being transparent and giving people control over their data is absolutely crucial. People need to know what data is being collected, how it's being used, and what rights they have to see it, change it, or delete it.
It's about making sure people can make informed choices about their data and that it's not being used in ways they didn't agree to.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual rights, it's also about preventing the misuse of that data for things like surveillance, discrimination, or manipulation. We need clear ethical rules and regulations for how that data is managed in this whole battery swapping system.
It's a complicated issue with no easy solutions, but it's a discussion we need to have as a society. With any powerful technology, there's always the potential for good and bad. It's up to us to make sure that battery swapping is used responsibly and ethically.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why it's so important for people to stay informed, ask questions, and be part of these conversations. The way we get around in the future is being decided right now, and we all have a role to play in making sure that future benefits everyone.
This has been a really fascinating look into the world of battery swapping. It's a technology with a ton of potential, but it also brings up these important questions about sustainability, fairness, and data privacy.
It reminds us that technological innovation isn't just about cool gadgets. It's about people, values, and choices. It's about creating a future that aligns with our hopes for a world that's more sustainable, just, and equitable.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up. Thanks for joining me on this electrifying journey. Until next time, keep those wheels turning and those minds engaged.